Lord and Master, Acts 27. We've already looked at the motivation of missions, prayer and missions, being a super supporter of missions, and the call of God to missionary work. So let's think tonight about the missionaries' Lord and Master. The reading is going to be from Acts chapter number 27. And this is very near to the end of the book of Acts, you realize, and very near to the end of the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul. The year was probably about AD 59. Paul's 3 missionary journeys are complete. And since Acts 21, he has been 2 years in prison, first in Jerusalem, and then in Caesarea. And now in Acts 27, Paul is on board a prison ship headed for Rome, where he'll spend another 2 years under house arrest. Our theme is going to come out of verse number 23, the missionaries' Lord and Master. Now verse 23 says, "For there stood by me this night the angel of the Lord, whose I am and whom I serve." I love that phrase. That's Paul standing on the bow of the prison ship on his way with a bunch of other prisoners to Rome, and they are in the middle of a great big storm. So let's read the entire passage starting in verse number 9, Acts 27 verse 9. "Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Claudia, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, stake sail, and so were driven. And we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship, and the third day we cast out our hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long absence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. That's a wonderful reading about a really treacherous journey that Paul, a seasoned traveler, was on. I can't imagine the number of times that he had sailed from one place to another, and this was probably the worst storm that he had ever been in. But there with him was his Lord and Master, whose I am and whom I serve, verse 23 says. Now, I have just a few simple points. How about verse number 1? It was determined that we should sail into Italy. So I'm going to say for the first point, Paul's Lord and Master determines what should be. Who determined that Paul and this ship should sail to Italy? I mean, one would think naturally maybe Paul determined, or since he was a prisoner, maybe the government officials. Maybe we heard earlier in Acts about King Agrippa. Maybe it was King Agrippa who determined this prison ship will go to Rome with Paul on it. But just flip back to Acts 23 and verse number 11. And way before King Agrippa or those government officials or even the prison boat, Acts 23 verse 11, and the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. Those words are in a red-lettered edition of the Bible, because they are the words of the Lord Jesus. Jesus determined that Paul would go to Rome. And my Lord and Master has decreed many things, determined in advance, and declared what would be before it even happened. God knows everything. And there are so many things that have already been determined, even though they haven't happened. It was determined. This ship is going to Rome. These prisoners are going to Rome. Paul is going to Rome. God decreed that. And nothing was going to stop them. Some things that have been determined or decreed are, for example, the preservation of this earth until the end. I mean, we don't know what sort of asteroids are out there or what could be cooking in the middle of the earth, but it has been decreed that there will be 7 years of tribulation on this earth, and then a 1,000-year kingdom for Jesus Christ to rule and reign over. And then the devil will be loosed for a short season, and at the great white throne judgment, everything will be rolled up like a scroll and done away with. That's all determined. So this earth will be preserved until that happens. And nothing is going to interfere with the preservation of the earth. Here's another thing that's been determined. The date of your death. It's already been determined. You don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. But God has appointed a day and a time, and I would say he even has determined the manner in which you'll die. Because he said to Peter at the end of the Gospel of John, you're going to stretch out your arms and die in the same manner that I did. And Peter said, well, what about John? And Jesus essentially said, don't you worry about John. I've got him taken care of too. I know exactly when and how he's going to die. It's all been determined. We have a God, a Lord and Master, who has decreed certain things to happen. It was determined that Paul would go on that ship to Rome. The protection of the church is another one. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So God has a plan, and things will go much more smoothly if I find and cooperate with God's plan than trying to fight against it. Certain things have been determined. Secondly, you'll see here in the reading that we just had in Acts 27, the majority disobey. So the master determines and the majority disobey. In verse 9, Paul was on that prison ship. It was late in the year. Paul was an experienced and determined traveler. He traveled many times by ship on his missionary journeys. And in verse 9, Paul advised the crew to wait until winter passed. But verse 9 says that as he admonished them, verse 10 and 11, they decided to believe the experienced and sort of expert or professional, the master and owner of the ship. Now, that's normally a good idea, to pay attention to what some professional, some experienced person has to say about things. But what a contrast here between a humble believer in Jesus who says that he's heard from God, as opposed to an expert who has all of this experience. The world would always say, we have to follow the expert. He's done the study, he has the experience, we have to do, and that's exactly what you see here. The majority say we're going to follow the expert, not the humble believer in Jesus Christ who Dr. John Phillips says was in touch with God. They'd rather have somebody with a position or a title. Now you'll see that they still got to Rome. It was determined, but they had a much harder trip. It was much greater loss. The journey was much more difficult. It was determined whether they went with Paul later in the year, like in the spring, or they went at that time. They were going to get to Rome, but they would have had a much easier trip had they listened to the humble believer who was in touch with God. And it may be the same way with you. God has certain plans in your life, and he's going to bring them to fulfillment. And it'll go much easier if you cooperate with him and you listen to what he has to say. You'll get there one way or the other, but you may have much greater loss if you listen to others instead of what the Lord is directing you to do. And then we saw the dangerous trip, the disastrous trip, as that big storm Euroclydon came up, and along about verse number 14 and 15 and 16, that ship was just being rocked and torn to pieces in the Mediterranean Sea. And yet, in verse number 23, in the midst of that storm, which these people had caused by their own foolishness and disobedience, Paul's Lord and Master came with divine comfort. He didn't come in anger. He didn't come in judgment. He didn't come saying they should have listened to him in the first place. He appeared in the words of one of his servants and said, here's the plan, here's the guidance, here's the direction, here's the comfort. And they arrived safe to shore. So it was determined they would go to Rome. They decided to go at their own time, according to their own plan. They got there, but it was a much harder trip. And thankfully, in the midst of their storm of their own causing, the divine Lord and Master came to comfort and guide and direct them. So you might be in a storm tonight, and you may have caused the storm. But Paul's Lord and Master, the missionary's Lord and Master, still has a plan and can help you arrive safe to shore. And I use that term because on Friday nights, Crystal has been teaching the kids this little song called My Lighthouse. And they have all of these great little actions that they have to this song, My Lighthouse. And the last phrase is that they're safe to shore. So they go, safe, and then they do this kind of swoop to shore. And you see all the kids here on Friday night, they're doing such a great job. They're going safe to shore. And it's a really nice song and a really nice action. And I was thinking of that while Paul was standing up on that boat. He said, guys, we've gotten into a big mess here by going our own way at our own time. But if we follow my Lord and Master from this point on, we're all going to get safe to shore. And they did, with great loss, but they saved their lives. So as by fire, James would say. But they got there. And you'll end up where God wants you to be if you follow his plan instead of yours. All right, next week we'll go on and say a little bit more about missions, and then 2 weeks we'll have our missionary fellowship with Blake and Ellen and David and Joy.